هكذا كنا نخط الحروف على الألواح ونتعلم في ظل نخلة أو تحت مصباح. رغم بساطة المكان كان في القلوب نور لا يطفأ وإصرار على العلم، ومن تلك البدايات ولد الحلم الكبير، حلم التعليم الذي لم يتوقف عن التطور. بدأت رحلة الإنسان نحو المعرفة، رحلة لا تنتهي. يأتي الاهتمام بالتعليم في صدارة أولويات الدول والحكومات، لأنه الأساس الذي تبنى عليه نهضة الأمم، وبه تصاغ ملامح المستقبل. فالتعليم ليس قطاعا كبقية القطاعات، بل هو قلب التنمية النابض ومحرك التقدم الذي يصنع الفارق بين أمة وأخرى. ومن هنا توجه الجهود وترسم السياسات لتطوير المنظومة التعليمية وصناعة بيئة تلهم المعلم وتمكن الطالب وتواكب العصر بعلمه وتقنياته. وفي دولة الإمارات حققت الحكومة قفزات رائدة في صناعة التعليم، وذلك عبر انتقالها من أساليب ومناهج تعليمية بدائية وتقليدية بسيطة إلى مستويات راقية رافقتها إنجازات تعليمية مميزة على مستوى العالم، حيث مر التعليم بدولة الإمارات منذ بداية القرن العشرين بعدة مراحل. انطلقت من التعليم التقليدي المعروف بالمطاوعة والكتاتيب إلى الانطلاقة الحقيقية للتعليم في دولة الإمارات بعد تأسيس الاتحاد في عام 1971 ميلادية حتى يومنا هذا. فتواصل الدولة عملها لتطوير منظومة تعليمية مبتكرة تعزز تنافسية الدولة عالمياً. كما تلقى المنظومة التعليمية في الإمارات اهتماماً كبيراً متزايداً وعناية خاصة من صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان رئيس الدولة، حيث تعمل الإمارات على تطوير مناهجها باستمرار بما يناسب التطور العالمي.
فتحنا لهم مدارس، فتحنا لهم علم، ثقافة، جلبنا لهم العلماء من شتى الأماكن، كل لأجل ينفعون أنفسهم أولا ويرضون أهلهم وينفعون الدولة.
في الفجيرة كان التعليم في صدارة الاهتمام منذ البدايات، ففي عام 1961 افتتحت أول مدرسة نظامية في الإمارة، المدرسة الصباحية، التي أسستها الحكومة الكويتية آنذاك دعماً لمسيرة النهضة التعليمية في الخليج. ومنذ تلك الخطوة الأولى انطلقت الحكاية التعليمية التي وصلت الإمارة البناء عليها بفضل توجيهات صاحب السمو الشيخ حمد بن محمد الشرقي حفظه الله، عضو المجلس الأعلى للاتحاد حاكم الفجيرة، حتى غدا التعليم ركناً راسخاً في نهضة الفجيرة ومسيرتها نحو الغد.
اهتمام صاحب السمو الشيخ حمد بن محمد الشرقي عضو المجلس الأعلى حاكم الفجيرة حفظه الله بالتعليم بدأ من منتصف السبعينيات. كان يهتم بالتعليم ويتابع أمور المدارس، يزور المدارس، يلتقي بالطلاب، يعمل معسكرات صيفية حتى لتدريب الطلاب والثانوية العامة. الآن بدأ يركز أكثر على مستقبل دولة الإمارات ومستقبل إمارة الفجيرة بأن يطور مؤسسات التعليم حتى تتواكب مع احتياجات سوق العمل. سموه صنع المستقبل عن طريق خلق جامعات ومؤسسات تعليم سواء كان تعليم عام وتعليم عالي للإيفاء باحتياجات التنمية وسوق العمل. الشيخ حمد صنع الحاضر ولكنه يفكر في صناعة المستقبل عن طريق تطوير كفاءات مواطنة بين المتعلمين وخريجين الجامعات والمدارس المؤهلة لسوق العمل
بنهج متصل بالرؤية نفسها. يواصل هذا الدعم سمو الشيخ محمد بن حمد الشرقي ولي عهد الفجيرة حفظه الله، فقد أولى سموه تحديث البنية التعليمية عناية خاصة وأطلاقه للبرامج النوعية التي تنمي مهارات الطلبة في العلوم والتقنية والابتكار، مثل مبادرة نشء الفجيرة، رواد التقنية، التي تتيح للناشئة فرصة التعلم التطبيقي المكثف في مجالات البرمجة وأدوات الذكاء الاصطناعي، بالإضافة إلى مهارات ريادة الأعمال والأمن السيبراني. ومعرض الفجيرة لكتاب الطفل الذي يقام سنويا في الإمارة بهدف الاحتفاء بالعلم والإبداع والمهارات المعرفية لدى الأطفال وترسيخ ثقافة الاطلاع والقراءة لديهم. تتكامل رؤية القيادة في إمارة الفجيرة ليبقى التعليم ركنا راسخا في نهضة الإمارة ومسيرتها الواثقة نحو المستقبل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سمو الشيخ محمد بن حمد الشرقي ولي هذه الفجيرة، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، حضورنا الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي في البداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. معاكم أخوكم يونس سيف، ويسعدني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة الحوار في مجلس محمد بن حمد الشرقي. حضورنا الكريم، المحاضرة ستكون بالإنجليزية ويمكنكم استخدام السماعات للترجمة. شكرا. Your Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Hamad al-Sharqi, the Crown Prince of Fujira, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Mohammed bin Hamad al-Sharqi Mejlis, a Mejlis that has been set up under the directives of His Highness the Crown Prince and organizes the 100 most influential and inspiring women globally. Without further delay, we ask Ms. Raya to kindly deliver her speech. Please.
Thank you so much. Your Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here today and share more about my mission and my work at School of Humanity. I'd like to start with a fundamental question, which is, what is the purpose of schooling? Now, this sounds like a very obvious question, but I think that it's one that we don't ask ourselves enough. For some of us, the purpose is just to learn, but learn towards what? For others, it might be to find a path towards economic development. But for my team and I, when we asked ourselves this question, we decided that the purpose for us was to contribute to the flourishing of people and the planet. Now, it's really important that we ask ourselves this, because the purpose drives how we measure success, and how we measure success determines what gets taught in school. So this is an old age saying. There's a saying in education for the longest time that what gets measured is what gets taught. So whatever we determine as success, so for example, if it's exam results, that's the thing that teachers and students will focus on. And I've sat in many boardrooms of schools, and I see the leadership focus on the next inspection. That's the thing that determines their success, right? The rating. So week after week, the meeting is how do we get from good to outstanding and so on. But what if we changed the metrics of success to match our purpose? How would that change behavior and drive different kinds of teaching and learning in schools? So keep that in mind throughout today's presentation, because I'll come back to it. Now, this is a question that has actually pained me throughout my formal education experience. So I used to be a straight A student up to 11th grade, and then it all came crashing down. I started getting horrible grades. And you know why? Because I discovered entrepreneurship. So I started working on companies and initiatives when I was about 16, 17 years old, and started spending a lot of time actually creating things that have a positive impact on the world. That felt like my calling. I really enjoyed it. And while doing that, I simply just did not put as much time into memorizing the textbooks, and I didn't do very well in my assessments. And this continued throughout university, where it was just the same cycle of lecture, exam, forget everything, next course, lecture, exam, forget everything. I think we all know that cycle very well. And that was, for me, quite painful, because I got to experience working in the real world at a young age and saw the skills that I needed to thrive versus the skills that we tend to focus on in formal education. Now, I was doing my degree in neuroscience. I was studying the brain. I was working in a memory research lab. And while the science behind our brains are utterly fascinating, I also wanted to go beyond the box, and I was really curious about the philosophy behind all of this, the nature of consciousness and what it means to be a human being. I was curious about the ethical implications. It's called neuroethics, so understanding the ethics of brain-machine interfaces. I was interested in neuroeducation, which is applying the study of the brain to how we teach and how we learn. And so in other words, what I was craving was an interdisciplinary understanding of our brains, going beyond traditional subjects to the connections between these different fields. And so all of this is ultimately what led me to my work in education. It was out of my dorm room in university that I started my first ed tech company. It was inspired by a saying that if something really bothers you, do something about it. And so that was what inspired the move to education. So a few years ago, when my team and I were working on School of Humanity, we applied a method of innovation called first principles thinking. So first principles thinking is a framework or philosophy where you essentially erase everything you know about a certain system and you start from the beginning. You start from scratch. So just to apply a mental experiment, a thought experiment here, imagine our education system today didn't exist. There was no legacy regulation, there was nothing. And we created a system for today's world from scratch, right? So the questions we would ask ourselves is, for the year 2025 or for the next 50 years, what are the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that will drive to the flourishing of people on the planet? Remember, that was our purpose. What are the pedagogies or approach to teaching or learning that contribute to this outcome? And then how do we incentivize learning, and how do we measure this kind of a learning towards this outcome? These were the questions that my team and I asked 4 years ago when we were creating School of Humanity and essentially starting from scratch and creating a new education system for our world. So let me take a moment to share a bit more about what we do. School of Humanity is an award-winning online school where we learn by doing and having a positive impact on the world. We applied first principles thinking to reimagine education. So instead of exams, all our assessments are project-based. Learners evidence their learning through projects. Instead of having one curriculum for all learners, every student has their own personalized curriculum. And lastly, we don't focus on memorization. Instead, it's focused on whole human development. Now, one of the first questions people ask me is this a real school? Yes, it is. It's a real school. We are licensed as a virtual school out of the Department of Education in Florida, and we are accredited by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. And the accreditation process took us years, and so there's a lot of rigor behind it. And we have students in our school from over 32 countries now across 6 continents. And fun fact, about half of our learners are in Asia. And I share this fun fact because oftentimes when people hear about something really progressive and radical, they often think, okay, that's for Western families. And there's a stereotype that maybe Asian families are more conservative. That has not been the case. We have seen that actually there's appetite for this model of education globally. And so when we were creating our school, we said it's not only important to reimagine how we learn, but also what we learn in school. The curriculum itself needs to change. And you'll notice a lot of the innovation I'll speak about have very little to do with technology. Technology is like the least important thing to me when it comes to innovation and technology, innovation and education. We need to also reimagine what we learn and how we learn. And so this is a glimpse into our core curriculum standards at our school. We call them the human literacies. Illiteracy is defined by the OECD as a combination of knowledge, skills, and mindsets. And these 8 literacies represent what we focus on in our core curriculum. So you can see in our core curriculum that flourishing skills like emotional intelligence are just as important as math. Creativity skills like futures thinking and creative expression are just as important as science. And thinking skills like systems thinking and computational thinking are just as important as English. And in grades 9 and 10, our students need to demonstrate minimum mastery of a certain number of competency from each of these literacies in order to move on to grade 11. Remember, what gets measured is what gets taught. So as a team, we said, what if we actually said creativity, flourishing, thinking skills are graduation requirements. You have to show mastery of these competencies in order to progress through our curriculum. That completely changes what your educators end up focusing on. And so how do we work towards these competencies and towards these literacies? At our school, all of our courses are project-based, which means we learn by doing. This is just a glimpse to some of the challenges that we run with our learners. Examples include protecting our oceans, activism through arts, designing with nature. And so they're constantly learning by applying these literacies to real-world contexts and learning by doing. Now, challenge-based learning is a pedagogical approach that exists. We did not invent it, but it's inherently an interdisciplinary approach to learning, meaning we don't learn the subject separately, we learn them in connection with one another. And this idea of interdisciplinary learning is also not new. I know many schools in the UAE do cross-disciplinary weeks, or they do occasional multidisciplinary courses, but the idea of a full interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach is more unique in that the entire curriculum is built this way. Now, why do we have to have this approach to learning? The reality is that the challenges of our world are becoming more and more complex, and it takes this kind of an approach of thinking to tackle them. So let's look at an example. One thing that's on all of our minds is maintaining global peace, right? We're constantly thinking about that in the region especially. Now, in order to maintain global peace, yes, we need to look back through time and learn from history, but we also need to look at it through the lens of psychology and biology by understanding the nature of our emotions and how we overcome ego as societies. We need to look at it from a lens of economics. How does resource scarcity contribute to conflict? We might look at it through the lens of environmental science and how climate catastrophes might lead to mass immigrations and conflict. And so one single discipline or subject can't help us understand peace and contribute to it, but rather a collection of them can. Similarly, let's look at designing space habitat. Many of us dream of becoming a multiplanetary species. The UAE is leading the way when it comes to space exploration. Yes, we need a lot of the science, the engineering, the physics, but we also need to ask questions of politics. Who's going to lead and manage our future space habitats? There's a question of psychology. How do we ensure our astronauts are able to stay sane and safe and enjoy in space and enjoy their experience? From a biotechnology perspective, we might say, how can we create materials that can last in space and so forth? Now, these two examples I just shared are actually our courses at School of Humanity. These are the kinds of things that our learners are learning every day through the lens of different challenges. Now, as I mentioned, the challenges of our world are getting increasingly complex. And two mega trends that I always get asked about in terms of implications are climate change and artificial intelligence, right? The world that our learners might be inheriting might be a scenario where extreme climate events such as floods or hurricanes become the norm, and so we kind of have to learn to cope with that. And at the same time, we all are thinking about artificial intelligence and the disruption that's going to have on our workforce and our education systems, and how we prepare the next generation for that. So for our grade 11 and 12 curriculum, this is what we're focusing on at our school. Our learners are doing year-long challenges. This year, we're doing Building Sustainable Futures and Ethical Technology, and I'm going to share a glimpse of each of them. In the Building Sustainable Futures Challenge, we're essentially asking how can we create an exciting future for humanity that is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we combined it with the Pearson Edexcel qualification, the EPQ. And in this challenge, they're looking at things, again, through an interdisciplinary lens. So they're asking the question of the biology question of our interactions between human and nature. But we're also looking at it through the lens of arts and how arts can drive action in climate. We're looking at it through the lens of data and actually analyzing data when it comes from the UN SDG data sets. And once again, it's going to take an interdisciplinary approach to create a sustainable future. And that's why this curriculum is built in this way. Now, another group of learners are currently engaged with our Ethical Technology Challenge. Now, I get a lot of questions around AI literacy and preparing the next generation to be literate in AI and be able to process in AI, and that's absolutely the question we should be asking ourselves. But we should also think about the societal and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. I would want to live in a world where future AI leaders also aren't just amazing at computer science, but also understand humanity and understand society and understand politics. And that's what's going to take to ensure responsible use of AI, which is why, once again, we built our curriculum in that interdisciplinary way. So our students are not just learning how large language models work, they're also understanding regulations behind it, understanding how these technologies might shape our mind, how the disruptions to the workforce might pose societal challenges and how we cope with that, and so on. So let me tell you now a story of one of our students, because you're probably wondering, what does this look like in practice? So this is Nouri, one of our learners. She lives in Dubai, she lives in the UAE, and her family was homeschooling her before they enrolled her with us full time. And during her time, Nouri has worked on a range of really inspiring projects. So she founded Feed India, which is an NGO focusing on food security in India. One of her projects that she worked on was ACT, an AI certification for transparency, so that AI could be developed in an ethical and transparent way. And she also worked on a group project with one of her classmates in Japan on a financial literacy program for Japanese speakers. So they got to collaborate on that project as well. And yes, Nouri is still learning English, math, and science, don't worry. So she's still doing inspiring projects on human body as a system, critical thinking, literary analysis, understanding beauty, and so forth. And all of these learning journeys for Nouri are project-based, so she's actually applying her learning, her assessments are projects as well. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, but what about the traditional tests, and why did we choose not to go with that? Now, I completely understand that at scale, standardized tests play a critical role in scaling assessments, and I recognize the role of that. But we also believed as a team that traditional closed book, time-bound, paper-based exams have a narrow view of intelligence. I go back to my own story. As a young entrepreneur, I was learning so many skills by doing things, but those weren't captured in my report card. According to my report card, I wasn't very smart, and I can tell you the impact that that had on my psyche. So think about all the students that are intelligent in so many brilliant ways, but we just don't capture it because we're not assessing it and we're not measuring it. And the challenge with exams, too, is that we focus a lot more on recall. Now, especially at advanced levels, you just have to memorize so much in order to be able to apply it to the test. It's just the reality of how much information there is out there to know. And so as students, we end up spending so much time memorizing, and that just leaves very little time for skill development. And so that is why we went with alternatives. We still do formative assessments, but all of our summative assessments are project-based. And we also focus on multimodal ways of evidencing. So some of them might be presentations, some of them might be case studies, problem sets, group work, internships, so many different ways to evidence a skill. And we said, what if the measure of success wasn't just the grades, but the impact you have on the world? How can we drive learners towards that? Now, another question you probably have is, what happens to the report card? How do we issue a report card in this case? Now, in order to be able to meet university requirements, we do still issue a GPA transcript, but we focus more on something like this. So this is something called the Mastery Transcript. We didn't invent it. It's created by the Mastery Consortium of schools. And it's essentially a group of hundreds of schools that have come together and joined this club of alternative ways of evidencing. So as you can see, the Mastery Transcript is essentially a portfolio-based transcript. You list all of the competencies that a learner has mastered. It's interactive. So you can click on a competency and then see the projects that the learner did according to that competency. And it can be personalized to the curriculum of the school. So it might have different categories depending on the curriculum of the school. What's very inspiring is over 300 universities already recognize this transcript. That means over 300 universities, mostly in US, Canada, few in Europe and Australia, are saying we will happily accept this instead of a traditional report card. And this is groundbreaking because this is often one of the bottlenecks of change. One of the hardest things to change is this piece so that you can have university acceptance. And we're seeing more universities start to accept this, which is wonderful. Now, you're probably also wondering, okay, how do you convince the parents to sign up to this? That's another frequently asked question I get. And I always tell my team, we're not in the business of changing anyone's mind or convincing anyone. The families that come to us are already in pain about the existing system. So in the United States, homeschooling is currently the fastest growing form of education. It's outpacing private and public school growth. What this tells me is that there is a growing segment of families who are frustrated with the status quo and are looking for something different. And often when there isn't a local alternative, they switch to homeschooling. It's not just the US. We're seeing a similar trend in UK, Australia, and Canada post-pandemic as more and more families say, I need something different for my child. And there are many children who are just really struggling in the existing system. And anecdotally, while we don't have a lot of data behind it, I'm seeing a lot of growth amongst the expat homeschooling community in the UAE as well. There's multiple homeschooling associations, and they're growing very fast. And in order to meet this demand, there is a growing movement of schools and universities emerging. So this is where I want to emphasize that School of Humanity is not just one isolated example. We're part of a movement of schools and universities. And this was part of the inspiration behind what we do, is we saw that there are these very innovative schools that have been around for decades. And they've been in these isolated examples around the world. And we said, what if we use technology to make this approach accessible to families everywhere? And so let me share a few examples of some of these schools, because they're quite inspiring. This is the Agora School in Netherlands. It's a school with no curriculum, no teachers, and no classrooms. Every student has their own personalized curriculum, and the educators are coaches. And the learning space is open. There's flexibility. Learners get a lot of freedom on where they learn from. This is the New View School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a micro school, so it has roughly 60 students at a time. They take up a floor or two of a building. And it follows the architectural studio model. So they learn through 2-week innovation sprints. And the New View School, by the way, has graduates that have gone to MIT, Harvard. They've been around for a really long time. This is the Green School in Bali. They're also another school that said, we're not going to do A-levels, we're not going to do the exam-based approach. And instead, they created their own sustainability-focused curriculum. So at their school, you're really focused on learning from nature and actually taking a holistic inquiry-based approach to learning. And it's not just schools. One of my favorite universities is the London Interdisciplinary School. It says school, but it's actually a university in London, where instead of choosing one major, you learn by solving problems. So every term, the students have a different problem. It could be wealth inequality or climate, and you learn by quantitative and qualitative means to solving that problem. And it's fully accredited. They had their first graduating class last year. Some of their graduates are artists, some of them went to work at Goldman Sachs, and others are launching companies, all from the same degree program, because the focus is on how to think rather than specific bodies of knowledge. And last example, this is Minerva University. It's an online hybrid university, so they have online lessons, but they have campuses around the world. And so students spend a semester in a different country, and they get to live all around the world while they get their undergraduate degree. Another fun fact here, Minerva is more competitive than Harvard. So it's very hard to get accepted into Minerva. And I share this because sometimes people assume that these alternatives are easy, and that's often not the case. They often have a different kind of rigor associated with them. And as I mentioned, technology is an enabler here. It's not the main point. We focus too much on tech when it comes to innovation in education, and not enough on the innovation in the curriculum and the way that we teach and the way that we assess. But I will say it is very exciting because anyone that's been in education knows that project-based assessments are so time-consuming for teachers. They take forever. And this is where technology is very exciting. We now have AI that can be a co-grader and help personalize things at scale and open up a lot of the teachers' time to focus on coaching and inspiring their learners. And this is where the role of the educator changes in models like this. In models like this, the educator isn't just transferring information. We call our teachers learning facilitators. They're facilitating learning. We even have a different team that does instructional design, designs the curriculum. And we have a different team that does the learning administration. And we bring in industry mentors who do the industry expertise. Traditionally, teachers do all of this. but we found it a lot more efficient to actually help teachers focus on their strength and work together as a team. Now, coming towards the end of my presentation now, I want to focus on the system as a whole, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about how can we have more of this? How can we create more models of education that have this philosophy? And very quickly throughout our journey as a team, we saw that we have to look at the system at large. We can't just start a school without dealing with the system. What I mean by this is, of course, we had to think about the regulatory landscape. We had to go through accreditation, and we had to consider what the university requirements are. Then we had to understand parent mindsets. So in order to create anything like this, we had to zoom out and actually look at the system and take a systems perspective to the challenge. Now, we also applied a framework called the iceberg model. This is actually something we teach our students when they're tackling different challenges. So often when we look at a problem, we don't spend enough time understanding or analyzing the root causes of the problem. So for example, I spoke about how many students hate going to school. We know that there's a massive skills gap, which is the skills that we're focusing in education versus the skills that we actually need in today's world. But let's ask, what are the patterns that lead to these events? Which is, most schools are bound by subjects, exams, report cards, and other industrial era features. But then we go deeper and say, what kind of structures lead to these patterns? Well, many countries in the region have, obviously, Ministry of Education equivalency requirements. There's local laws around schooling and outcomes. University admissions are a structure that leads to these patterns. And then we say, okay, what are the mental models that lead to these structures? Parent expectations, lack of trust, right? We're afraid to give schools freedom. And also human narratives, the stories we tell ourselves, how we imagine schools to be, as well as values around structure, discipline, traditional values, these all contribute to the structures. And so with any problem, if there's one thing you take away from this, if you're ever solving a problem, apply this framework to the problem and see if you can go deeper to the mental models. Now, I know School of Humanity is not the right approach for all students. In fact, I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all. Like, when I think about our education system, I don't imagine one way of learning that everyone does. A healthy education system should have alternatives. It should have lots of different options so that families can choose what works best for their child. Now, we're an online school, but I showed you examples of nature-based outdoor schools. Right? There are lots of progressive hybrid schools. I'm a big fan of micro schools. These are schools with 60 to 100 learners. The reason I love these kinds of schooling is because they require minimal investment to launch. So you end up with entrepreneurs that are very passionate, being able to start the school without relying on the big private equity firms and the big school groups to invest in them, and they're often resistant to change as well. And you have homeschooling pods emerging, alongside, of course, online schools as well. A healthy education system should have these alternatives. And in order to have these alternatives, we need the appropriate regulatory environment to recognize these alternatives as equal to the traditional system. And that's my vision and hope, is that we end up with a healthy system that has options for families around the world. Now, I want to end on a quote from a futurist that I'm a big fan of. He says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And that is the framework that I've seen most successful around the world when it comes to creating alternative models of education. I recognize it's very difficult to go into traditional schools and do this, and that's not what I'm advocating for. But to share an example, Taiwan, I recently learned, the country of Taiwan has a different regulatory framework for experimental education. That's what they call it. In Netherlands, they have a different inspection framework for special schools. So what they did is they created an alternative space for these alternative approaches of education to recognize them, regulate them, ensure they're safe, and so on. And so that's my hope, is that we start creating more of these alternatives in the education system. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Raya, for your valuable and inspiring lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the next part of today's gathering, which is when we present Ms. Raya with a selection of questions submitted by audience via the QR questions code that we have sent to them. Let me start with the first question. The first question comes from Maryam Ali. She asks, I'm a teacher, and I'm struggling with how much students rely on artificial intelligence, tools like ChatGPT, to do their projects. How can we deal with this generation when technology is doing their homework and projects also for them without any real efforts or research from their side? I think this is a big story that a lot of people, a lot of situations that we go into, and a lot of people talk about this. What is your response?
It's a huge challenge, and I completely empathize. It happens even in our context, so I absolutely get it. So there's layers to this. I think from the rule-setting layer, what we did the moment ChatGPT started taking storm a few years ago, we actually set the guidelines with our students together. So we got together and did focus groups with our learners, and we established scenarios where you can use AI, where it helps you learn, and scenarios where you can't use AI, especially when it misleads others about your ability. And so we started with that place. Then I think the next stage, which was the more sustainable approach, was to rethink how we assess learning. So when we're designing assessments, we actually ask ourselves, is this AI proof? Could an AI do this? Or can we design it in a way where a student is almost forced to share their process, their thinking, their reflection, and they have to go through all of these steps and show their process behind it, not just the final deliverable. That helps make it AI proof. And then finally, I do think there are some tools emerging. For example, one that we use that I recommend all teachers use for writing assignments is called GPT-0. It's a plugin that you add over Google Docs, and it shows the entire writing history. So it shows you from start to finish the writing process that a student took. And we use those kinds of tools to see, okay, what was their process behind this outcome? And it adds another layer of supervision to that approach. And I think fundamentally, we really try to also focus on helping learners understand the value of learning the skill themselves rather than just relying on AI.
I think with time, students are getting more and more intelligent when it comes to ChatGPT. They are finding ways to cover up all the traces that they leave. So
yeah, we had one student who would add typos to his essay after GPT wrote it, just to get away with that. So I understand. But the value of things like GPT-0 and mandating learners do not just their essay. You ask them to submit their research. You ask them to submit their thinking, drafts of the essay. You end up getting all the steps, and it helps. It makes a big difference.
But it also applies to videos, presentations that are created now. DeepSeek and Deep Search give you the person's face with the lip syncing, with the person's voice, and they give you a perfect presentation. And you won't be able to differentiate between that and the person. So how about that? How do we deal with all of those different...
That's where a live conversation can absolutely debunk how much they know and don't know about a certain topic. Yeah.
Our next question comes from Saif. He asks, a wonderful session, of course, and his question is to you: what future skills should teachers develop to keep up with the revolution of rewiring education? That's your field.
It's a brilliant question. I think teachers are at the forefront of this discussion. They're on the ground implementing this, and ultimately we also need to upskill and reskill an entire generation of teachers if we're going to move towards this approach to learning. Now, a lot of the skills that I speak to, such as interdisciplinary thinking, the literacies in our core curriculum, are essential for educators as well. I think that the best educators in today's world are often amazing coaches. They're amazing mentors. They guide learners towards the answer via Socratic questioning. That is a skill that I would love to see more educators adopt. More often than not, they're not just specialists, they're generalists. So they're able to make the connections between different disciplines and create those inspiring learning journeys. We also see from reports that the role of a teacher is one of the hardest roles to automate via technology. That is specifically because educators aren't just transferring information. Of course, platforms can do that. They're guiding learners, they're supporting learners emotionally, and so that's critical. And so in order to be an AI-proof educator for tomorrow, I think focusing on emotional intelligence, interdisciplinary thinking, critical thinking, Socratic questioning, these are some of the skills I would look for in educators when hiring them for our school.
I would just like to jump in with that question and ask you, sometimes you have educators, teachers that are very educated, they are up to date, but they do not know how to relay that information to their students. How do you pick a good teacher from a bad teacher. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be a bad teacher, but it's just the communication skills when it comes to transferring the knowledge is not there.
Absolutely. And this is, by the way, a huge problem at university level. You have amazing researchers who are brilliant researchers, but not the best teachers. They weren't hired to be teachers. They were hired to be researchers, and now they teach on the side. And that's a big challenge with that as well. What I tend to look for is actually presence, public speaking, and communication, right? You really have to be able to hold the stage for learners. The skills that you have as a host, right? Like being able to actually engage learners and have those public speaking skills. Then it's really about being able to create inspiring learning journeys. Can you take them on an awe-inspiring journey through stories, through visuals, through projects, rather than just telling them what you know? So those two pieces are critical.
It reminds me of a professor I had in the U.S. and he would walk in as an actor. He wouldn't teach. He wouldn't open the books, and you would necessarily not open the book throughout the whole semester. He would act out the whole. It was a political science class. He would act out the whole book for you, and then you would see that everyone in that class had amazing grades.
Exactly.
And it was the most difficult subject, political science 101. I'm sure you know how difficult it can be for people, especially international students coming to the US to be educated.
Absolutely. I had a very similar experience. My favorite neuroscience professor was an amazing storyteller on stage. Like he would just come, it was like lecture hall, but he would come in and tell us amazing stories and explain things in inspiring ways. And that's what it really takes. And we all also got really good grades as well.
Next question comes from Sarah. Her question is, what kind of skills should students gain from project-based learning that cannot be developed through exams?
All of them, really. I think if I just use examples of creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, public speaking, these are not skills that you measure through tests. You have to see what a student can do with that skill. And that's where project-based learning and project-based assessment comes into play. Now, it's very easy to convince people with those skills, but I'm actually going to say even things like scientific thinking, because we tend to say, all right, but science stuff, you need to be able to remember all the facts. But the scientific process of formulating a hypothesis, investigating it, gathering data, analyzing the data, coming to conclusions, and contributing to body of knowledge absolutely should be measured through project-based learning and not through paper-based exams. Similarly, quantitative reasoning skills, math, the process of going through the data life cycle, so gathering data, analyzing it, and then visualizing it, I believe is best measured through projects. And so whatever skill you take, it is best measured through project-based assessments because you have to see what a student can do with that skill in a real-world context.
Being hands-on, being very hands-on. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I've seen in a lot of schools, especially here also in the UAE, and that is really changing. They're introducing more field activities that help the students not to just memorize, as you said, to apply those skills to the real world. And from your perspective, how much more of that do we need in the field?
Yes, you're right. There are lots of amazing schools doing this co-curricularly, cross-curricularly, but you also have qualifications like BTech now that are largely project-based, or the EPQ, which is also a project-based qualification recognized with UCAS points and so on. It's not about how much more, it's about can we have systems that are fully like this, right? Because there are students who are still juggling these projects against their exams. And the reality is, and you know, when my first company was focused on the extracurricular angle of this, the reality is as long as it's extracurricular, it won't be as important as the exams. That's just the reality, right? The system is designed where that exam results is the most important thing. But can we create alternatives where actually it's flipped, where maybe we take the SATs every year to make sure we're on track, or the MAPS test, but the focus is actually project-based assessments. That's really the fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves.
Very interesting, that is. I got another very interesting question. It says, why is modern education against memorization? I think some students would like that. No more memorization, you know, just open book exams. So he asks, can't we consider students' reliance on memorization as a form of different intelligence?
That's very fair. For some students, it comes very naturally. I mean, I had peers who would just remember from the class. And for me, it was very hard. I had to really like flashcards and the spaced repetition. Look, I think the big challenge is, as human beings, we're just producing so much information. So every day, we're producing something like 400 petabytes of data and information. Now, it's a big number, but to visualize this number, it's essentially a mountain of DVDs. We're surrounded by mountains of Fujira. So visualize a mountain of DVDs every day, every year, across many years. That's how much information we are producing as a species. And all our bodies of knowledge, the scientific, the economic, is constantly expanding. We're just producing so much. So there comes a point where it's just not practical for anyone to remember everything in their discipline. Now, I'm not saying, okay, sure, up to maybe 8th or 9th grade, yes, you have to have conceptual understanding of all the fundamental knowledge of the geography and biology, but even in high school, there's just so much to remember for each subject. And that takes so much time. It takes time for the teacher, the student, and that is time they could be spending developing fundamental skills that we absolutely know we need, right? So time is a limited resource here that shapes things. And so that's kind of where it comes from. It's like we cannot keep memorizing and memorizing as our species progresses. There's a point in which the focus really has to become on how you use this knowledge. Do you know where to find it? Do you know how to analyze it? Do you know how to apply it? That really needs to become the focus.
That takes me to another point that I would like to discuss with you. The conventional educational formula is memorizing. It's all about memorization. It reminds me of a professor I had who was in his late 70s, and a lot of students would come up to me and tell me, you know, how long is this going to go on? What are we going to memorize all these formulas for?
Yeah.
When we go to the workplace, we don't need to memorize anymore. We have the book right in front of us where we can take full advantage of that. Instead, we need to apply these formulas to the real life skills, or the real life skills, to what we really need to do in our workplace. So some professors are very open to that. They will accept it. But then you have others that say, no, you need to be able to memorize some things, because when it comes to applying it, when you have it in the back of your head, you can get it done on the dot. You don't need to go back to your phone or any kind of script that you might have prepared beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key is everyone will end up memorizing some things, but it will depend on your context, and you will learn that when the time comes. So just to share another example, I was doing my degree in neuroscience. Most of my lessons were memorize this textbook, listen to this lecture, and so on. And then I worked in a lab for a year, and we were doing memory research. I didn't end up using anything from the lectures. My PI, my research advisor, gave me a number of papers and said, this is all the information we need to know for this particular context. We ended up learning that, and we applied that particular set. I didn't need to memorize 4 years worth of information. And so you end up learning it contextually in the context that you're in. I think what's also important is that you have awareness of the information. You know, okay, there are these fields in neuroscience, and there are these subjects, and there's these models of thinking and learning, so that then you know where to go looking for it when you do need it, when the time comes.
Ms. Raya, let me ask you another question. When it comes to educating our younger generation, it comes, especially now, beginning with KG1, they're given a tablet. They get so used to that. You have the autocorrect system where they don't need to think anymore. All they need to do is to put the first few letters, press on it, and you get the letter. You get the word right in front of you without putting any cognitive steps into it. You know, you don't need to think of anything. So what is your reply to that? When should students be introduced to tablets?
Yeah, so my view on the use of technology in classrooms is nuanced. For early years, I'm a big advocate of nature-based learning and play-based learning. So I completely understand the frustration. I know there's a big debate around handwriting and whether we should be teaching, in Arabic calligraphy and so on. Yeah. And I still advocate for it, because even if they don't actually need to use it, there's a cognitive skill that you're building when you learn how to write. And there's embodiment with our bodies that's, I think, really important to develop in young minds. But as they get older, I don't believe all screen time is equal. I understand the need to regulate some screen time, but doom scrolling is not the same as the time that you spend creating things and learning things and connecting things with a device. And so my view on it is it really depends what they're using the screens for. There's also a very fascinating philosophical theory called the extended mind hypothesis. It basically posits that our devices are not this separate thing, they're an extension of our mind.
Nice.
So we use the telescope to extend our eyes, we use our phones to extend our memory. And so when you look at it that way, it also changes the way you see our relationships with our devices. And you may or may not agree with that view, but that's also a lens I try to apply and think, are we using this as an extension of our intelligence, or is it taking something away from who we are? Yeah.
It depends how you view it. I had a professor coming on to my show, and he said, the smarter the devices get, the dumber we get. So I don't know how you view that opinion.
I really see it as an augmentation of our intelligence for adults.
Okay.
I think the risk is with young people who haven't had the chance to develop that skill themselves. So I understand where that comes from. And I do think it's absolutely critical that young people do develop that skill themselves before they augment it with technology.
The next question asks,
Sure.
after your years of experience, what do you think is the ideal way to assess a student?
It comes down to what you're assessing and how. So I've spent a lot of time already talking about project-based assessments, and I do believe that they're very powerful. I think I can go a bit deeper into how to scale project-based assessments, because one of the risks with project-based assessments is subjectivity. Different teachers might think an outstanding presentation is different things, and it might be implemented, if you implement it across hundreds of schools, in different ways. And some of the ways you can standardize them is by, just as I showed you our human literacies framework, some countries are creating their own competency framework, their own mastery framework, so that all of the schools are working towards a consistent set of rubrics and outcomes. And so all the projects end up being assessed by consistent standards across the school. It's also very important in project-based assessments to do regular moderation, where you sample works and you see if they're being graded ethically and sustainably. And so that kind of moderation is very important. Now, I do believe there's a place for standardized tests.
Right.
For example, the SATs in the US are a really important way to equalize things across different income brackets. Because in a lot of contexts, it's wealthier families that can do these projects, that can do extracurriculars, whereas the test is the same for all, and everyone has access to Khan Academy. And so there's an equity discussion in standardized tests I don't want to ignore. That is also crucial. I do think they have their place, but I would like to see it be the minority of the grade rather than the majority.
That question, by the way, was from Rola Taneji. She asked that question just to bring that. Now, a lot of political issues do come and take away education from students. You have conflicts happening around the world, and as we speak, in Jamaica, they have the worst hurricane ever recorded in human history. That will take away more than 80% of the schools. How do students, despite these situations, still get educated?
That's where digital education is really powerful. And we've been at the forefront of this. So yes, we're a private school, but because we follow a sliding scale tuition model, we have families that don't pay anything that get enrolled into the school, and we also tap into government funding in some countries. And so we have had students from the conflict in Sudan. We have had girls from Afghanistan in our cohort. We have had asylum seekers who've had to leave their countries, enroll. And so we've actually ended up getting a lot of experience working with this kind of student. Now, at a systems level, every country almost needs to have this backup infrastructure for digital learning. I think the UAE did this very well during the pandemic, where tens of thousands of teachers were trained during a week in online learning, and you had this kind of transition.
So you believe the same system can apply for...
It can, but I think we can do better as a species overall. Because what ended up happening during COVID was, naturally, because it was a time of crisis, everyone just shifted what they do in person online. So you just moved the class to Zoom. Whereas what we know as an online school, that you just design things very differently if you're doing it for online. You have to change the way you design your lessons, the way you do assessments, the tools that you use, everything is different. And so we can go a bit deeper, I think, to create the right infrastructure so that when we do that switch to online during a time of a pandemic or a crisis, that the infrastructure is there and the training is there for it.
Ms. Raya, another question has come in. It's asking you, how do you know what to really teach in a school?
Great Great question. I think this is
What topics to focus on?
Yeah, I think this is open to debate. There isn't one correct answer because, look, we looked at the research, we looked at reports from World Economic Forum, from even consultants like McKinsey, and said, what are the most in-demand skills in the workforce? So that's one question we asked ourselves. We then asked, what kind of a world do we want to live in? Because the world becomes what we teach. How can we teach the next generation those skills? Now, this question is open to debate because we all have different visions for the world, and we might focus on slightly different values. And then we asked, what does it mean to live a life of flourishing? If we want these young people to flourish in life, what kind of human skills do we need to teach them? And once again, we looked at the research, and that's what we based it on. We update our curriculum every year. We go through an annual review, an audit, and ask, is it still relevant, and what do we need to include? And so you have to be adaptable.
Right.
And then the final thing I would say here is sometimes you don't have to set a curriculum. The learner sets it for themselves. And so there's this idea in education around emergent curriculum. It's basically where you don't go in with a curriculum, you go in with a process. And throughout that process, the student creates the curriculum for themselves. And in that model, it's really up to the learner to decide what they learn.
It is, definitely.
Yeah.
Final question has come in from Latif Al-Kindi asking, what is the future of the School of Humanity, your School of Humanity?
Oh, thank you for that question. So our online school has been doubling year on year in growth, and we hope to continue that. We're also, we launched a middle school this year, so we now have students as young as 11 in our program. I believe the future of education is hybrid. We started as online, but I really believe the value of in-person can't be taken away. So we're now partnering with schools around the world who want to offer our diploma as an alternative pathway within their school. And so that's something that we've been working on. And then we occasionally also do projects with governments who say to us, help us do this at a national level. So we're actually doing a project with the Abu Dhabi Department of Education right now to bring competency-based learning.
Are you active in the region here, or is this
Yes,
around
very,
the world?
very. We've done work in Saudi and Abu Dhabi, and there's huge appetite. And of course, being such a visionary country, they're at the forefront of asking these questions around how do we bring this kind of education to the world. Ultimately, I see us as becoming this alternative education system that's globally recognized and that is designed for the flourishing of people and the planet.
I'll ask you another question, which is very off topic.
Yes, sure.
The world is talking about the three-eye atlas.
The comet.
The
yes,
comet.
Yes.
And many people say it's an object. No one knows what it is exactly. So what is this? What is, when it comes to the school of thought that you come from, what information do you use to analyze the information that's coming from two sides? Thinkers saying, you know, this is not not a comet, this is an object because it looks completely different. And this is the third of such objects that are coming close to our solar system.
Yeah, it's a mysterious question. The scientist in me will always say, I don't know until the evidence proves otherwise, until I have more data. I'm actually
Data's coming in as we speak.
We'll wait for the data. I think there's a deeper question in there about how do we know what is true? And it's so important. In the day of social media, we're all in our echo chambers. The algorithms decide what is true rather than an objective means. And that's where the study of epistemology, which is the philosophy of truth, is crucial. It's actually teaching young minds the different ways of coming to the conclusion of truth. One is empirical, the scientific way. Another might be observational, and so on. And actually spending time thinking about this. And then we do have curriculum, we do have projects centered around this question. The other thing that fascinates me about this is the cosmic perspective.
Right.
Because sometimes we forget that we're in this tiny pale blue dot of a planet floating in space, in this vast universe, bigger than anything we can imagine, and we forget how fragile we are. And so moments like this just remind us, like, hey, there's a whole universe out there.
Right.
And you know, and I love that it does that, especially because we don't always get to see the stars at night with all the light pollution. So I'm glad that we're thinking about the night sky a bit more with these news.
Any final thoughts to end the question session with?
Just gratitude for creating space for this. When we did the root cause analysis, I think you all saw that the deepest cause of the education system being the way it is, it's our beliefs, our imagination. Most of us, when we close our eyes and imagine school, we have the same kind of vision. But I hope that I opened your imagination to what school can be. And I think one of the things that makes this very powerful is that we're changing narratives and changing stories that we tell about schools and what the vision for school is. So thank you so much for creating the platform and the space for this discussion. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
And any final advice to teachers and educators?
I think
in
that,
the UAE?
Yeah, start by creating alternatives. Don't worry about changing the status quo yet. I understand that's a massive question. Maybe that's a question for the leaders of the room to think about. But
Of course.
create alternative pathways. See if you can have a lesson a week that's focused on interdisciplinary learning. Can you have one pathway within a school that is more alternative? It's much easier than trying to change the status quo to think about creating these alternative pathways.
Very true. I would like to thank our audience for their thoughtful questions. In the interest of time, we will conclude the questions there. Distinguished guests, as we conclude our session, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Hamad al-Sharqi, the Crown Prince of Fujera, and for gracing us with your presence. I also extend my thanks to Ms. Raya Bidshahri for her insightful lecture. Finally, I express my appreciation to our distinguished guests for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you to future knowledge-sharing sessions. We wish you all a great day ahead. Thank you for being here with us, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.